So we'll have a discussion on paper 1, right? Public administration, right? So what I understood from this question paper is there are not so many tricky questions. Even I couldn't find a single question which is so tricky, right? Most of the questions are relatively direct. Of course, some questions are abstract, right? But if you know the syllabus and if you understand some concepts, I think you can attempt this question paper. That is what my observation or my analysis with regard to paper 1. There is not even a single question where you often find, tough vocabulary. Even the words are relatively easy. Earlier, maybe some 5-6 years back, the vocabulary used to be relatively tough. But now, simple vocabulary they are using, right? Now, they cannot change the name of Francis like it, right? It is the name. So, there is no possibility to change the name, right? Other than that, it's fine, right? Now, before going into the question paper, as usual, I said section A consists of the first 6 chapters and section B mostly consists of the other 6 chapters. And even if you just go through the question paper, you will understand that once again. This hypothesis is once again proved. The section A mostly covers the first 6 chapters, right? And as usual, the first 2 chapters, again, important. In this particular question paper, from the chapter 1, 45 marks are asked. And from chapter 2, 55. And from chapter 3, 50 marks. So these 3 chapters almost, how many marks? 150 marks out of 400. So you have to write 250 marks out of 400, right? So 150 marks are from these 3 chapters, first 3 chapters, right? And in section B, almost chapter 9 on personal administration, chapter 10 which is on public policy, and chapter 12 which is on financial administration. These 3 chapters were given importance. From chapter 9, almost 50 marks were asked from personal administration. From public policy, 35 marks. And from financial administration, 45 marks. This is what the weightage. Now, based on this, you have to develop a strategy. Based on the weightage, you should be able to develop a strategy for the next exam. Right? How many of you have gone through the question paper? What about others? Okay, fine. Let us not go into the details, okay? We'll start because it takes much time. What I'll be doing is that first I'll read the question. I'll try to locate it. What is the syllabus, right? That is what we call syllabus mapping. So I'll try to do the syllabus mapping and I'll try to give a brief idea about this particular or a particular question. That is how we try to do, okay? Now, this is what the question paper. Yeah. So the first question is about public management. So I'll read this question. Public management taken what and why from public administration and how from business management. The directive is elaborate. I told you what is this public management before. Public management is simply trying to incorporate the managerial principles or managerial practices in public organizations. That is what basically public management. And this public management was there since the inception of the discipline public administration. Even Woodrow Wilson also have done that. But there came a new model in 1980s and 1990s, and that new model is new public management. The question is mostly about the new public management. Right? So we know what is this new public management. New public management is basically about reforming the government to provide goods and services with high levels of efficiency, economy, and productivity. These are the 3 E's which your NPM is trying to focus upon. And I told you before also, the other name for NPM is reinventing of the government. They are not questioning the government. They want to reinvent the government. That is what the basic difference between public management in the first half and NPM. This is a basic difference. They were not questioning the government, but they want to reinvent the government. And how they want to reinvent the government? By focusing on decentralization, by using of technology, by devolving of authority, by bringing in some innovative personal practices like outsourcing, downsizing, right sizing. This is what your David Osborne and Ted Gabler gave in his book, in their book called Reinventing of the Government. Now the question is about NPM is all about how efficiently you deliver the services. But what services you do? And why are you giving those services? This is a political question which is derived from public administration. And how best you have to do is an managerial question. They are trying to improve the system to achieve what the public administration is striving to achieve. So this is a blend of both public administration and business management, right? So this is a very popular statement actually. It's directly picked up statement. It's not they have framed it on their own. This is just a statement which was lifted from IGNOU material. So it's not something they have framed on their own, all right? So this is what the basic thing, public management. And the second question, every human organization shall, from system 1, I think some words are missing here. Every human organization shall gradually move from system 1 and ultimately end up with system 4. Some spelling checks. Comment on Laex statement. So we knew that Francis Laex is a participative school thinker. He tried to analyze various organizations in United States of America, and he wants to find an answer for a question. And the question is, what is the best managerial style? That is a question which he wants to answer. And to answer that question, he came up with a management on continuum basis theory. He says management can be understood as a continuum. On the left hand side, you have style 1. On the right hand side, you have style 4. And every organization should gradually shift from style 1 to style 4. And the names which he gives for style 1 is the exploitative or authoritative style of management. And the name which he gives for style 4 is the participative style of management. And the style 2, he calls it as benevolent style of authority. And style 3, he calls it as consultative style. And it's not an organization can jump from style 1 to style 4, but there should be a gradual movement from style 1 to style 4. And why he suggests a gradual movement, or why an organization should move to style 4, it's because of some unique advantages which style 4 have. This style 4 is basically, we call it as organizational humanism. There are a lot of humanistic aspects in style 4 when compared to your style 1. The style 1 managerial style is proposed and of course implemented by your classical school thinkers. And if you adopt a style 1, people will never get empowered or developed. So we have to gradually move to style 4. So you have to write that managerial continuum and what are the features of style 1, style 2, style 3 and style 4. That's all. It just the tabular column that we have used, you just have to reproduce there. Alright, there is nothing. If you want to take an opinion because it's a comment, you can say, of course, style 4 organization is a very idealistic organization, and particularly in developing countries or third world countries, it is very hard to transform an organization into style 4. If you want to give your opinion, because that is what comment. Otherwise, just you leave. Right? So this is what the second question. The third one, all tribunals are courts, but all courts are not tribunal. ఇవి రాత్రి నిద్ర పట్టకపోతే వచ్చే క్వశ్చన్లు అండి ఇవన్నీ. Alright? All tribunals are court, but all courts are not tribunal. This we can understand through maybe a Venn diagram. So I can say this is tribunal and we can say this is a court. So the diagrammatic itself is showing what the question is. All tribunals are courts, but not all courts are tribunals. Means, what is the essence of the question? The functions, the jurisdiction or the responsibilities of the courts are much beyond than the tribunals. Or in other words, tribunals are subset of courts. Most of you may not know at this point of time, there is a topic called administrative law, right? We have, that is the 6th chapter. So in that we'll be discussing something called administrative tribunals. Alright, National Green Tribunal, Central Administrative Tribunal, State Administrative Tribunals, all these are examples of tribunals. Right? Now what is this concept? Maybe some of you may not know at this point of time. Now tribunals are basically bodies constituted for administrative adjudication. Tribunals are those bodies which were constituted for administrative adjudication. Or in other words, tribunals are those bodies which are primarily constituted to resolve issues related to administration. But courts fundamentally deals with constitutional matters. Courts fundamentally deals with constitutional matters. Which is big? Administrative matters or constitutional matters? Constitutional matters. Tribunals basically follows principles of natural justice. Principles of natural justice. They do follow these principles of natural justice while deciding on a particular issue. And courts do follow natural justice, but more than that, they follow procedural justice also. What are the right procedures that are being followed in addition to principles of natural justice? And the most important thing which your AV Dicey said, tribunals are examples or manifestations of your administrative law, which is again a subset of rule of law. And courts follow rule of law. Alright. So maybe because of these differences, what we can say is that tribunals are just a subset of the courts. Right, but not the other way around. Right. So this is what the question, this is from administrative law. Right. You have to write for 10 marks, right? 150 words. Yeah, this is what, it's a question directly asked. Next, D, 1D. Classical organizational theories formed the bedrock for the modern organizational theories analyze. You have to do an analysis how classical theories are the basis, are the foundations for your modern theories. We have different names to refer classical school of thought. We can call these theories as technical theories, We can call these theories as apolitical theories. We can call these theories as closed theories. We can call these theories as structural theories. We can call these theories as mechanistic theories. All resemble the same. Basically, the classical school of thought emphasize on one best organizational form that gives you a maximum efficiency and productivity. See, this is what the basic essence of classical school. Classical school wants to come up with one best way of or one best organizational form that can give you a maximum efficiency, productivity. And to come up with that one best organization, they gives a list of principles. And these principles are universally valid. Right? And they assume human being as one of the factors of production. They assume human beings or employees as a factors of production. And if you give money, that itself act as an inducement. The question is not about criticism. Hello, please don't criticize these people. It is all about how these theories form the bedrock of the modern theories. Now the question is, what are the modern organizational theories? This is what the question. What are these modern organizational theories? Again, we have different names for these theories. We can call these modern organizational theories, particularly the theories that evolved post World War II, right? And we can call these theories as ecological theories. Or the other name which we can give to this is systems theory. And we have situational theory. Or the other name for this theory is contingency approach or contingency theories. And these theories are also called as, maybe I can say, that is what we can, organizational humanistic theories. Organizational humanistic theories. And you can also call these theories as open theories. These are the different names or maybe different components of this modern organizational theories. As the names itself says, these theories are not closed. They were trying to focus on the ecology within which an organization functions. Ecology means the environment within which an organization functions. Means the social, political, economic, cultural factors and its influence on administration. Systems theory also tries to understand organization as part of a bigger system or a supra-system. Situational theories or contingency theories are those theories which emphasize on a concept or a principle called it all depends rather than one best organization. There is nothing called one best organization which your classical school thinks, but they say it all depends on the situations, whether it is best or not the best. Now, whatever might be these theories, actually they try to get something from your classical school. Actually, the classical school laid a strong foundation for the emergence of modern organizational theory. That is what you have to substantiate. Today, you can focus on humanistic aspects, but before that, you should have a very core structure for the organization. Without organization, without structure, you may not have human beings in it. And the classical school principle, you can't design an organization which is illogical, which is inefficient, and which is ineffective. Even this theory also, this principle also holds good or forms the basis for your modern organizations. So this is what maybe a brief idea about this particular school. Of course, you may not know few theories at this point of time. Namma? it's not, there is no particular classical organization theories. Whatever we have discussed as part of your Henry Fayol, F.W. Taylor, Max Weber, all these are classical schools. Whatever the organizational ideas which they are suggesting, that is what the classical theory is all about. What is a theory? It's a set of ideas which they have proposed. Classical school, the theory, organizational theories which are proposed by classical school people, we call them as classical organizational theories. Okay. Now 1E, interaction between the state and civil society has hitherto been largely neglected. So why they got neglected? Intentionally. Particularly, especially in developing countries. Especially in developing countries. This is what the question. Interaction between the state and civil society has hitherto been largely neglected, especially in developing countries. Examine means you have to understand those interactions. I told you, civil society as an idea originated in Western countries, particularly during 1980s. The Minnobrook Conference 2 background, I can just use it as a reference model. Maybe in third world countries like India, it's something 21st century phenomenon. It was not, the civil society activism was not very much evident in the 20th century. We could find that activism more now. Anna Hazare movement, right? Mazdoor Kishan Shakti Sanghatan. Very often we see these civil society activism, which is of course a 21st century phenomenon in developing countries like India or third world nations. Now the question is, why these interactions between state and civil society were neglected before, particularly in developing countries? That is what the question. So first of all, you should understand the sort of interactions that state and civil society will have, and why do we need to have an interaction between state and civil society. We knew that we are in the era of governance, wherein a network of institutions are coming together for better delivery of goods and services. Because we knew that government alone may not be able to provide those goods and services. So what I'm trying to say, the interactions are inevitable. Government used to have a monopoly before, maybe because of that, this particular sort of interactions were restricted or prohibited. Government used to believe, or government used to have an obsession that they alone can do everything what people of this country want. Not only of this country, third world countries. But that assumption is a very megalomaniac assumption, a self-obsession that you are so capable of doing everything. That is not so possible. In 21st century, we have seen state have lots of limitations, government have lot of limitations, and we also knew civil society have certain advantages also. It is better you take benefit of those advantages. This is one reason. Government used to have a monopoly. Government used to follow restrictive policies. Maybe because this is one reason why there is a restriction in the engagement between state and civil society. And the second reason is that the penetration of civil society or the presence of civil society in third world countries is very much poor. For a civil society to function, active political culture should be there. Political awareness should be there. Higher levels of education should be there. Otherwise, people will not form an association and fight for public interest. And there should be also technological support, communication, proper communications. These are the prerequisites for a robust civil society presence. Without this, you can't expect a strong civil society. ప్రజల్లో చైతన్యం ఉండాలండి, అప్పుడే సివిల్ సొసైటీ ఉంటుంది. It's not by default people will have or form a civil society. Now, because of the education levels, because of the awareness levels, because of the media penetration, because of the other communication channels, yes, it is very easy to form an associations now. Maybe this sort of conditions were not so prevalent before. Of course, these conditions, something emerged in Western countries during 1980s, but in India or third world countries, it emerged relatively later. This is what that you people have to write as part of this 1E. The sort of interactions that happen between state and civil society, and you should just write what type of interactions will be there, like maybe what are called bringing in transparency and accountability, some sort of interactions that will be there, and you have to write why this sort of interactions doesn't happen before, what were the conditions, right? And you should also write what is the significance of these interactions within 10 marks. Within 150 words, you have to write it. Okay. Done. Now we'll move on to the other compulsory. This is a compulsory question. First question, you have to write all the 5. We'll move on to the 5th question. Then again, we'll come to the 2nd, 3rd, 4th. Right? 5th question. I told you the section B consists of those chapters starting from chapter 7 to chapter 12 in paper 1. Alright, we will see the section, that is what section B. Alright, yeah. The first question. Developmental administration embraces the array of the new functions assumed by developing countries. Explain. I think UPSC, to be honest, can't give questions easier than this. I can very honestly admit the fact, because if you people expect easy questions than this, UPSC cannot help, particularly with regard to the public administration optional. This is a very easy question. Those people who have understood something about developmental administration will know. See, developmental administration is an alternative model to the traditional public administration. You people may not understand at this point of time, but try to listen. Developmental administration is an alternative model to address the evils of traditional public administration. Or in simple words, after the Second World War, there is a strong belief, or there was a strong belief across the world, we cannot bring in development by using the traditional public administration mechanisms or frameworks. We need an alternative model, and the name given to that alternative model is what? Developmental administration, having characteristics like goal orientation, client orientation, time orientation, result orientation. In other words, it is a responsive and time-bound bureaucracy or timely bureaucracy. And this is a model proposed by the Western countries as a solution to address all the problems the third world countries are facing during 1950s and 1960s. In other words, this developmental administration is being proposed as a tool for post-war reconstruction and also to bring development in those erstwhile colonial countries like India. Right? Now, the question is very simple. How we try to embrace the array of new functions? What are those new functions, particularly in the developing countries during 1950s and 1960s? There are 3-4 pivotal or some prominent functions. One is nation building. The public administration primary objective is to bring or to ensure national making process or national building process. And the second important function which the public administration should do in 1960s is to bring modernization, because these are backward societies. You have to bring some sort of modernization. And the third and the most important function that these people have to perform is the social and economic development. Social development as well as economic development, because we know these countries are relatively backward socially and economically, so we have to bring some sort of development. And of course, the fourth important function is social justice, because these are heterogeneous societies. These are not homogeneous societies like your Western countries, and there are a lot of inequalities and discriminations on social aspects. So we have to ensure something called social justice. These are the top 4 functions, and developmental administrative system was proposed as an alternative variant or alternative model to achieve these core functions. That is what the question. This is what the question. Maybe old students, maybe I think you can understand what exactly this question is, right? The second, this is from developmental dynamics topic. Developmental dynamics, chapter number 8. Okay. Now 5B. Policy evaluation contributes fundamentally to sound public governance. Discuss. This question is from public policy, which is again, what is the chapter number? 10th, public policy. So maybe some of you might be knowing, see, public policy have different stages, and the prominent stages are formulation of the policy or policy formulation, then policy implementation, then you have to monitor the policy, policy monitoring, and policy evaluation. Policy evaluation is nothing but assessing the performance of a policy, whether they have achieved the intended objectives for which it was launched. Policy evaluation is just an assessment of a policy, whether it achieved the intended objectives for which it was formulated. See the irony or see the fun part. Traditionally, it is the bureaucracy who is to be involved in policy formulation. It is the bureaucracy who is to be involved in policy implementation. And it is the bureaucracy who is to be involved in a policy evaluation. So when bureaucrats are involved in policy implementation and when bureaucrats are involved in policy evaluation, can you expect that a real picture comes out of that evaluation? Can we expect? There will be a conflict of interest. They may hide the truth, right? And you know, the fundamental issue with Indian administration is most of the times people are worried with policy formulation. They don't give much importance to the policy implementation and they give minimal importance to the policy evaluation. Again, it is a belief because we have drafted the policy we know and no need to evaluate it. It's self-evaluation, self-understanding. The policy by default will be good. Most of the times, the policies of the government will not be evaluated. But one new trend emerged, particularly in the era of governance. Policy evaluation is happening. Not only it's happening, but it is happening or it's being done by a third party. That can be an example, you can write it. A third party, and people are also involved in policy evaluation. In simple words, what I'm trying to say, policy evaluation, which used to be a monopoly of the government prior to governance, in 21st century, multiple stakeholders are involved. Multiple stakeholders are involved in policy evaluation. What will be the advantage when there is an objective policy evaluation? What will be the essence or what will be the significance of it? Obviously, when there is proper evaluation, you can understand to what extent this scheme is getting deviated. You can do that mid-course corrections. And you can incorporate the feedbacks that you get. This is what we call systems approach is all about. Right? So, policy evaluation will try to improvise the policies and will try to correct the policies so that they'll achieve the intended objectives. Right? So, obviously, it will improve the governance or it will reduce the governance. It's a self-explanatory point. 5C. Weber's construct of bureaucracy. It's not if you find Max Weber, you will write Max Weber bureaucracy. No, the question is not about Max Weber. It's not about bureaucracy also. You don't even read, okay, Weber, done, gone. Irrespective of the other things, we will write about Max Weber. And even if possible, you will make an image of this guy, which is not needed. Understand the question. Old students. Weber's construct of bureaucracy has served a great heuristic purpose, a practical purpose, something sort of that. In furthering research in the field of comparative public administration, do you agree with the statement? Give reasons. Right? I agree with the statement because I thought of agreeing with it and this is what the reason I want to give. The core idea is very simple, and even you people can also answer it. Comparative methodology was there since the birth of the discipline called public administration. Now, comparative public administration is a new dimension or new subfield which emerged during 1950s and 1960s. That is a different concept. Comparative public administration, new discipline or new sub-discipline, I can say, which emerged during 1960s. The question is about how Weber's idea of bureaucracy formed a basis for comparative public administration that emerged during 1960s. That is what the question meaning is. I told you this before, even for the new students. Comparison is the basis for Woodrow Wilson administrative science. Max Weber also used comparative perspective to develop his bureaucracy. And the comparison is what? 3 types of authorities he was trying to compare. Traditional type of authority, charismatic form of authority, and legal rational authority. He was trying to adopt a comparative methodologies to construct bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is an idea based on legal rational authority. We have discussed that. Now, how this used as a basis for comparative public administration? Now, you should write, yes, comparative perspective as an idea or methodology evolved with the birth of the discipline, and the most prominent people are Woodrow Wilson and Max Weber. You should emphasize on Max Weber. They have developed a universalistic theory. However, the comparative public administration that emerged in 1960s was different when compared to the methodology or the comparative methodology used by Max Weber. The difference is very simple. Though Weber used comparison, it was done focusing only on a single institution. He haven't compared institution in its context. What I'm simply saying is that comparative public administration is more ecological than Weber's theory. Comparative public administration is more empirical than your Max Weber. Comparative public administration is more nomothetic than your Max Weber's ideographic analysis. The new students may not know these terms. Don't worry, we'll be discussing those topics. But comparative public administration, though learned something from comparative typology used by Max Weber, but this is relatively far ahead. That is what my statement is. Though there are some aspects of Max Weber in comparative public administration, but it have a new elements also. And the new elements are ecological, nomothetic, and empirical aspects, which are not there in Max Weber typology. Right? This is what is a very straight question. If you just go through your slides, you will find question there. Right? If you go through, condition is there. Okay. The D question. And on the face of it, to be honest, I have to be very genuine, right? It became so difficult to map this question first of all. But after a close reading, what I could find is that he is asking or twisting the code of conduct and code of ethics in a different way. The essence is something sort of that, but yeah, it can be placed in personal administration, and you can also place it in techniques of administrative improvement. Not a big deal. Here the question is simple: standards and regulations. See, regulations are rules and laws that will guide a person to do a task. That is what a regulation. Regulations are laws. Regulations are rules. Regulations are some guidelines that will guide a person how to do a particular task or a work. Standards are those principles or those values which will guide a person not only to take decisions but also how to perform a work or how to do a work. Standards are some principles or some values that guide a person in his work. In other words, Regulations are external, standards are more internal. Regulations are extrinsic, maybe standards are very much intrinsic. Whether it is regulations which will control a person or whether it is standards which will control the person, the answer is both are needed. Now, code of conduct is something, sort of guidelines or regulations that will try to control the behavior of a civil servant. These are external controls needed. Code of ethics is something, some values that you have, something that is very close to your conscience or which is very much intrinsic to you. I am using relatively technical vocabulary because this is an answers I am discussing. I am not discussing a class to give you a meaning of each and every word. I am just trying to discuss you the content that we have to reproduce here, or that the content that we have to think upon, right? So that is what these two are very much needed. Both will be guiding a person. Both standards, which are nothing but principles, or the values. Regulations are nothing but the rules and the laws. Both are very much needed. Alright. So this is what, so simply putting, internal and as well as external controls are needed for a person, so that his behavior towards the work is maybe guided in a better way. The next topic is from Financial Administration. 1E, Financial Administration, the 12th chapter. See how you can fit in the so-called hypothesis that we have developed. That section A consists of the first 6 chapters and section B consists of the other 6 chapters. It's a hypothesis, but every often we are able to prove it. And this year also we can prove it. Okay. So that you people might be questioning, sir, 5C Weber is there. Now your hypothesis is gone. It's not just Weber is there, your hypothesis is gone. It is the question, the essence of the question. This question is from Comparative Public Administration, chapter 7. Now, outcome budgeting addresses the weaknesses of performance budgeting. Elaborate. So, budget is basically the fiscal policy of the government. Budget is nothing but a fiscal policy of the government. What is the fiscal policy? It's basically about how the resources are being mobilized and how those resources are being spent. That is what basically fiscal policy, and fiscal policy is reflected in something called annual financial statement, which is the budget. Almost on budget they ask 2 questions in this exam. There are different types of budgeting. There are different ways or different methods that you follow while drafting or while making a budget. Like line item budget, zero based budget, performance based budgeting, gender budgeting, social budgeting, outcome budgeting. These are different types of budgeting. Now the question is about 2 types of those budgetings. One is outcome budgeting and other one is performance budgeting. Outcome budgeting was introduced in India, I think maybe in 2005 and 2006 when Chidambaram was the finance minister. Outcome budgeting was introduced. And performance budgeting, which was there, I think performance budgeting started somewhere in 1960s or 1950s, end of 1950s. This performance budgeting got incorporated with outcome budget somewhere in 2009. Till then we used to have a performance budgeting and outcome budgeting as a 2 different components, but now we have one budgeting because outcome budgeting is an improvised version compared to a performance budgeting. So what is this performance budgeting? What is this outcome budgeting? Again, I will not go into the concepts. Anyhow, I will be discussing that, and I have discussed for you people. Performance budgeting is that budget where the focus will be on outputs. What are the outlays? How much of the outlays we have? And what are the outputs that is being generated? In other words, it focuses on the quantitative targets. It focuses on the quantitative targets. For example, government very often say we have allocated this much of money for construction of roads. if you try to apply performance budgeting, what is the length of the road that you have constructed? How many kilometers for a certain amount of money or for a certain price? This is a performance related target where you are focusing on the physical output or physical target or quantity. Here the focus is on efficiency. The focus is on efficiency. This is what we call performance budgeting. The focus is on efficiency. How best we can use inputs for producing a particular output is an efficiency question. Yes or no? That is what efficiency is. What? Input by output? That is not efficiency. If you want to define it, you can define it in your own way, right? Performance. Now the question is about, there are some weakness in this. We need something which is an improvement on performance budgeting. That is what? Outcome budgeting. Outcome budgeting. Now outcome budgeting is focusing about the outlays and how much of outcomes that it is trying to create, which is a qualitative target rather than a quantitative target. Here the focus is not only on efficiency, the focus is here on effectiveness too. For example, construction of a school, how much of money you have allocated and how many schools got constructed is a performance related question. Whether that schools are able to give a quality education or not is an outcome centric question. Understood? Now which is important and which is significant? Outcome based budgeting. Now we are following this outcome based budgeting. It is an application of your concept called NPM. NPM makes you to focus on outcomes, not on outputs, which you have read. So this is just an application of NPM on financial administration. Understood? Different types of budgeting. So 10 compulsory questions we have discussed. Have you found any sort of difficulty in it? Particularly the old students. I don't want to here behave like a certain family, boasting of myself, because I'll be posting this as a recorded video, so I don't want to use any names. Now, what I strongly want to say is that if you closely read your content, done. Even no need to read extra book also. The class notes, or maybe if you refer the basic IGNOU materials. Even for this, most of the questions are your classroom centric. Content can be used, right? Again, if you do not want to believe, I'm not here to make you believe, right? Facts will be facts, right? And here I'm not doing it for any sort of marketing. Marketing is not needed. If you get rank, that will happen, not a big deal. But the issue is, this is the truth, right? Why am I saying and why am I emphasizing is just to take that bloody fear out of your head that public administration questions can't be handled. At least there should be one question, no, which should make us not able to do it. If you just basically read basic reading of your subject content, these 10 questions you can do it. Trust me. I'm not saying about the other questions, but these 10 questions you can do it, which are compulsory. You have to write it, right? Fine. Now, going to the 2A, second question. Second question. Somewhere I missed this question. Particularly, I missed this word for the new batch. Maybe in further in future chapters, I'll be discussing it. I hope you all knew this guy, Dwight Waldo. Dwight Waldo wrote a book called The Administrative State. I think we read Dwight Waldo as part of Minnowbrook Conference 1, New Public Administration. But his ideas, everything got reflected in a book called Administrative State. What this administrative state basically says, the question is about that only. What the administrative state basically says is that the bureaucracy should play a very crucial role in bringing development. You cannot leave development or growth to market-based forces. Administration or the bureaucracy or the government, they alone can do, they alone should do. Don't leave this to the market forces. And they strongly advocate, David Waldo, he strongly advocates state maximalism. I hope you all knew what is this word state maximalism. Government performing multitude of functions or maximum functions. And Dwight Waldo also argues that administration is an all-pervasive phenomenon. Means it should be there everywhere. Why? Because administrators are those people who have expertise and abilities to achieve or to solve various problems. Right? Because he believed that administrators have this noetic power, the power of knowledge, and they can use this knowledge and expertise to solve whatever the problems which a country is facing. And you cannot believe in the market forces because market forces are primarily driven by profits. This is what the core essence of the administrative state. Now I'll read the question. The administrative state is the creation of a power to bind us with rules that are not made by legislature. Discuss the constitutionality of the administrative state and its future. So actually, if you closely observe the question, it is a criticism on the administrative state. Because the administrative state is the creation of a power to bind us, something that is controlling us. That too with rules. These rules are not made by the legislature. This is what we call it as administrative legislation or delegated legislation. Means administration will issue bylaws, rules and guidelines to deal with various problems, not the legislature. For example, recently, this Prevention of Money Laundering Act was there in news. The question is about, you have given enormous powers to Enforcement Directorate to deal with money laundering. That is what just a fine example of this particular question. And even Armed Forces Special Powers Act. In Armed Forces Special Powers Act also, you give enormous powers to security agencies to deal with any violations. And the same with NIA. And the same with Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. And even the IT rules. Right? Yesterday or day before yesterday, it was there in the news. The IT rules. Recently, government asked 40 YouTube something, right? 2 days back. Some 10 YouTube channels, something recently happened. And what is the issue there? These people haven't followed the procedure established by law. So what the essence is, administration is taking enormous powers on its own to govern the country. And these bylaws, these rules, these guidelines, which are issued by the administrative authorities, are not even scrutinized by the parliament. If government comes up with a law, someone will be scrutinizing it. But we generally do not scrutinize the bylaws, rules or guidelines. But there is a problem with this. These rules, these bylaws or these guidelines can be used to control the people. Or this may result in something called a concept. Administrative despotism. Means administrators can become despots by using this sort of mechanisms. Like issuing of rules. We have this Environmental Protection Act. No. Now as part, that is a law. Now as part of that, government is issuing various rules, plastic waste management rules, solid waste management rules. This is what we call administrative legislations. Right? So, now discuss the constitutionality of the administrative state and its future. Now, administration should have the flexibility because 21st century we are witnessing a complex set of functions which needs to be performed by the administration. It's not every time you will go to the parliament and get a bill passed, and it will not happen. And the legislature do not have the expertise and time also. So what I'm trying to say, this flexibility is very much needed. However, They should obey the values and the premises that are mentioned in the Constitution. You cannot violate or abridge the rights or the values that are very much imbibed in our Constitution. You can do it because the complexity of the functions might make administration to be flexible, but you cannot violate the Constitution. In other words, administration should be within the bounds of the Constitution. Or in simple words, constitutionalism should be there. Constitutionalism should be there. That is what the question. Okay? That is what the question. Understood? This is what you have to write for it. And that is what is its future? Because 21st century we are witnessing the increase of complexity of the function. So administrative state is very much needed. Means strong presence of administration. But administration alone should not be present. It should be in collaboration with multitude of institutions. That is what the future of it. Right? And constitutionalism should be there always. Okay? Now 2B. Transformational leadership requires high degree of coordination, communication and cooperation. Explain. This is from your third topic, administrative behavior leadership. There are two types of leaderships, which I think I have told you. Transactional leadership and transformative leadership. Transactional leadership is that leadership which focuses on rewards for services. I'll give you money, you give in return service. That is what transactional leadership. This transactional leadership is followed by your classical school thinkers. Their leadership style is basically called as transactional style. We'll give you money, you give me the work. But the question is about not transactional leadership, transformational leadership, where you try to make your subordinates leaders. Transformational leadership is that leadership which is aimed at empowering the subordinates, developing the personalities of the subordinates. They are not just job centric like your transactional leaders, they are job plus employee centric. Right? And the transactional leadership is basically a formal leadership. Because of your position, you are a leader. You are a deputy secretary, so you are a leader. That's all. This is what we call positional leadership. But transformational leadership is not a positional leadership. It is a socially constructed leadership. Based on the rapport or based on the relationship, that leadership will emerge out of it. And for this, for transformational leadership to happen in organization, there should be proper coordination and proper communication and better cooperation. Because it is a socially constructed idea. It is a leadership based on the, I can say, based on the opinions of that particular social group. So there, the leadership should focus on transforming the subordinates. The real goal of a leadership is to not make followers, but to create leaders. That is what transformational leadership. In Mohit Bhattacharya, you will find a paragraph on transactional leadership and transformational leadership. Right? I think maybe this question somewhere got motivated from that book. Next comes this human relations school, neoclassical school, or Elton Mayo's ideas. Human relationists postulate that what is important to your worker and what influences his or her productivity level may not be the organizational chart. May not be the organizational chart. What is the other name for organizational chart? So human relationists postulate that what is important to a worker and what influences his or her productivity level may not be the organizational chart, but his or associations with other workers. Is it more relevant today? Simply, what is trying to say, how human relation schools are better than classical schools. what is the relevance of human relations school now? I'll adagachu kada sir ante I don't know, right? So that is what the question is, right? So tell me, organizational chart or Gantt chart, these are formal rules. These are the formal rules or the procedures that you people have to follow while performing your task, right? The classical school believed in those so-called formal rules and formal guidelines because they believed if you follow these formal rules or formal authorities or formal codes, by default, you will be giving maximum efficiency and productivity, right? This is how they have used to guide a worker or to discipline a worker. But the productivity is not just depends upon your Gantt charts or your formal charts or formal rules, but it depends on something called the associations which people have at the workplace, the so-called social psychological dimensions of an individual. So the human relations school focusing on group dynamics rather than understanding individual in an atomistic view. They are trying to understand individuals as part of a group, not as just a mere cog in a mission, right? Now, you have to write down the social and psychological contributions made by Elton Mayo and also the relevance of informal associations in organizational productivity. And in what way this is relatively better when compared to your classical school. I asked you a question, no? Neoclassical school is a bridge that connects classical and behavioral. So something sort of that. And you should know the relevance or you should write the relevance of these organizations now, right? Now I told you cult fit as an example. Cult fit, I told you that an example where people practice in groups. There is nothing called individual sort of training. This is just an application of the so-called human relations movement which focus on the group dynamics. The modern organizations are driven by the so-called humanistic aspects which we got or which we have learned from the neoclassical school. And what is that we can learn from these people? Informal associations in an organization. That also will have a relevance, right? So you can just try to find out some contemporary developments where you can use this concepts, right? Now, third question on Chester Barnard. Barnard posits the zone of indifference as the human condition that animates authority relationship and cooperation in modern organizations examined. Again, a relatively straightforward question. So the classical school believed in top-down authorities. According to classical school, authority is based on the person who gives the order rather than the person who is receiving the order. But Chester Barnard tries to say that authority is not based on the person who is giving the order, but the person who is receiving or accepting that particular order. That is what we call it as zone of acceptance as proposed by Herbert Simon, zone of indifference as proposed by Chester Barnard. You should know how to give orders. And you should know the factors that you should take into consideration while giving an order. You should know the factors. Like when you're giving an order, the communication should be clear and understandable. When you're giving an order, you should also understand the physical and other abilities and limitations of the individual to whom you are giving an order. When you're giving an order, you should make sure that order is in sync with the organizational goals. There should be congruence. And I had told you, these are the factors that defines the boundaries of the zone. And if you give an order that falls within this zone, there is a high chance of accepting that order by the employer. This is what the zone of indifference, and this is the basis for authority relationship and sort of cooperations that happen in an organization. And the executive, who is the head of the organization, should ensure that orders fell within this zone of indifference. There should not be a bossism while giving an order. I think we have discussed this concept and you have to write down. And he believes that the willingness of the people will be extracted based on this contribution satisfaction equilibrium and also right types of authority. Right? This is what this particular question you have to write down. It's not you will only emphasize on zone of indifference. You will write about Bernard, the 3 pillars of organization which Bernard suggested. You will write a brief idea of that guy and you try to emphasize more on this zone of indifference and how that will have an influence on authority relationship in an organization. And what are the factors that you people have to take into consideration while giving orders? Done? Right. New public service approach. I think most of you might know this. New public service celebrates what is distinctive, important and meaningful about public service. Discuss. Again, it's a very direct question. It is all about writing the new public service theory. That's all, nothing else. I told you, new public service is a criticism of your neoliberal philosophy or neoliberal theories. New public service is a criticism of your neoliberal theories. What are those neoliberal theories? Public choice theory and NPM. These are what we call it as neoliberal theories. Now, new public service approach is a strong criticism of those neoliberal theories. This new public service approach was proposed by Den Hart and Den Hart, who says that the object of the public administration is not rowing or steering, but it is all about serving. What is the question that should drive you is, are you serving or not? It's not about steering or rowing. And these people focus that the crown jewel or the crown gem that gives some sort of identity to public administration is that publicness. A publicness anedi public administration ko alankaran andi. And if you drop that public and there is nothing which you can say something great about you. Unfortunately, the neoliberal theories dropped that idea or a word called publicness from public administration. The strength of public administration is based on public interest and publicness. Unfortunately, those two ideas were dropped by your new public management and public choice theory. And this people wants to bring again the glory of the publicness in public administration. And these people were trying to say, serve citizens, not customers. Government should run like a democracy, not like a business. Government should run like a democracy, not like a business. These are some ideas that you people have to say, emphasizing how publicness once again became the core mantra or direction to public administration. Alright? That is what the question. Again, tough question. Strategic communication ought to be an agile management process. Discuss the conceptualization of strategic communication for the government actions. What is the strategic communication? Of course, we will be discussing this as part of the communication topic in administrative behavior. And we have discussed how much importance the communication is in an organization. We have discussed Chester Barnard views on communication. We also have mentioned Herbert Simon views on communication. Herbert Simon said, the decision making, the entire process of decision making is based upon the communication channels. If you don't have proper communication channels, the right supply of information will not be there. And if you do not have right supply of information, you don't have the facts to take decisions. And Chester Barnard said communication is the core pillar of organizations. If there is no communication, organization as an idea will be collapsed. But the concept is strategic communication. Strategic communication, if you want me to put it in a layman terms, strategic communication means sending the right message in the right way to the right person. That is what strategic communication in a simple way. Strategic communication is giving the right message or the right essence or the right information through the right way to the right person. That is what the strategic communication, and which is very precise and which is tailor-made sort of communication. So that organization goals will be achieved effectively. That is what the purpose of it. Now government is using these strategic communications to target the beneficiaries and by creating awareness. Maybe Swachh Bharat, whatever. Right now government is using various social media platforms to communicate the right message or the right essence of the schemes to the right channels, to the right people. That is what the present government is also using on. Not only state governments, central government, everyone is trying to rely upon this strategic government, and because of that, the communication between state and citizen will improve. And the trust or the credibility levels also will improve because of this strategic communication. And when you are targeting the right person, the communication will be efficient as well as effective. Now, for example, very simple, my strategic communication means today if we want to give an advertisement with regard to UPSC. Okay, we are starting a batch UPSC. Now, if I give this paper advertisement on a newspaper which is not read by civil aspirant, am I targeting on the right beneficiaries? But if I give that advertisement to Hindu newspaper, then I am just giving the message, right message, through a right mean, through the right person. That is what strategic communication, where it syncs with the organizational goal. Right? That is what the issue and how this is useful in the government actions. Whatever the programs we have, their government is trying to rely more on the strategic communications. This we will be trying to discuss as part of communication topic, administrative behavior. Done. Now 4A, leadership. These people are worried. I am saying I told you leadership is relatively important topic. Even Modi Saab is emphasizing more on leadership. We want leaders. We don't want administrators. That is what the question is. That is what the question is. Mission Karma Yogi or whatever, it's an effort to create leaders. There is a difference between leader. This question, tippi, they aduguta unnadu. We have discussed, last time they asked Warren Bennis, the difference between a leader and a manager. Now they are trying to understand that differences by giving administrator as a term. So you can write that tabular column which we gave that distinguish between these two people, but in a very twisted way, right? Leadership is seen as dealing with change. I told you leader is that person who innovates. He is not a Xerox, he is original. Leader is not a Xerox, he is original. He initiates, he innovates, he do not copies. Right? He takes risks. He gives broad goals, not the details. Right? Whereas administrator is viewed as coping with complexities. He is a person who manages things. Coping with complexities means he is the person who tries to manage the situation. Leader will never manage the situation. He understands the situation. There is a difference. Right? So, in this context, discuss the contextuality of a leadership and administration for the success of organizations. Of course, one of the factors that defines successful organization from failed organizations is leadership. A right leader can convert a failed organization into a successful organization. He can transform. That's why we read a lot about leadership. A right leadership is always create a moralizing force or create a motivating tendencies in an organization. నాయకుడు లక్షణం ఎలా ఉండాలంటే 10 మందిని ఎంకరేజ్ చేసినట్టు ఇన్స్పైర్ చేసినట్టు ఉండాలండి. He should be an exemplar of a high kind. He should not be a hypocrite. And he should not be just a copycat. He should be a leader in simple sense. Right? So the differences that we often discuss as part of leader and administrator, we can write that and how these two are very much important for any organizations. An organization can survive maybe if there are no employees, but if there is no leader, organizations will not happen. I told you the political organizations as an example, particularly in southern states, right? So you have to just write down, this is again a topic from your administrative behavior leadership concept. Understood? Regulatory governance frameworks have become essential building blocks of world society. Discuss their potential and impact in fulfilling the hopes and demands. There is a topic called regulatory bodies in chapter 4, regulatory authorities. This question is from that particular topic. The question is basically about the significance or the potential of regulatory bodies. See, the nature of regulation underwent a metamorphism with the advent of LPG. Regulation before LPG used to be something like controlling. Regulation means before controlling. Through your license, permit, quota system, you used to control something. But regulation after your LPG is about facilitation, not controlling. Actually, there was a growth of regulatory agencies after the advent of your LPG. We have witnessed the increase of various regulatory bodies, whether it is TRI or whether it is various bodies like your Real Estate Regulatory Authority, IRDA, Insurance Regulatory Development Authority, PFRDA, Pension Fund Regulatory Developmental Authority, and regulatory authorities with regard to educational sector. All these regulatory bodies were created mostly post LPG. Why? Because now government is in a steering role, not in a rowing role. Now you are giving a free hand to the private sector and you are taking a seat of a regulator so that there will be a fair play amongst the competitors, right? So this is what the question is about, and what is the potential to ensure proper competition and to prevent crony capitalism or private monopolies. We need strong regulatory forces. If tries, now we have TRI, but still we can see oligarchy in telecommunication sector, where the power is there within few players. TRI is there, but what TRI is not able to effectively deal with it. Still we could find oligarchy there. So we need a very strong regulator to prevent market failures. Monopoly of a state may be danger, but monopoly of a private sector is worst, double dangerous. Monopoly of a market, private sector, right? So yes, we need to write about those strengths and also the positive effect which it can create in achieving the demands or aspirations of the 21st century people. The aspiration of the people right now is maximum governance, minimum government. The regulatory framework should achieve that. In the name of ease of doing business or whatever, we are trying to streamline the regulatory frameworks in such a way that it is just playing a facilitative role rather than restrictive role. Right? This is what basically the essence that you people have to emphasize upon, right? Social auditing is not just saving the money, it creates positive impact on governance. I hope you know what is the social audit. So it is something, an innovation of 21st century in India. It is also an example of demand side accountability. There are two types of accountability which we have discussed, supply side and demand side. It's just an example of demand side accountability. Social auditing is assessment of the performance of various programs by the primary stakeholders. That is what the definition of social audit. Social audit is basically about assessment of the performance, particularly government performance, by the primary stakeholders. Ante NREGA scheme evaluation is done by the beneficiaries of NREGA scheme. That is what the thing. National Food Security Act, Integrated Child Developmental Scheme. These are some schemes where we have social auditing. Nowadays, states are also making social audit mandatory for various programs. But it's not about the saving of the money. That is very simple goal of social audit. This major goal of social audit is about how to make the government accountable, how to make the people empowered, and how to bring transparency in the governance, and how to improve the performance of the government, and how to strengthen the idea of democracy. These are the core ideas of social audit or core objectives of social audit, not just saving the resources. Saving the resources is there, but more than this, we have other substantial goals. That is what the question. Understood? Understood? Or is there anything, something which you can't read? Social auditing, oh my god, it's very tough to pronounce. Nothing sort of that, right? It's a straightforward. Sixth question. Do you remember the sixth question? Hello, ma'am. Sixth question. Where? Anywhere have we discussed this before? Actually, those words I have used in the recent class. Prithvi, అక్కడ రిక్స్ పేరు ఉంది కదమ్మా. We have discussed, right? Once you can go through the slides. See, in the recent class, when I was discussing colonial administration, I said colonial administration evolution are based on two forces. One is exogenic and other one is endogenic forces. Similar concept also there while understanding a theory proposed by F.W. Riggs, which is called as Prismatic Society or Prismatic Theory. According to F.W. Riggs, there are three types of societies. One is the fused societies or the backward societies, and the other one is the diffracted societies or the developed societies. There is some society intermediary between these two, which we call developing societies, and he calls them as prismatic societies. And the question we will understand. The more exogenetic the process of diffraction, the more formalistic and heterogeneous its prismatic phase. The more endogenetic, the less formalistic and heterogeneous. Examine the hypothesis of Riggs. Easy, don't get carried away by the words. Theory is relatively easy. Easy question. Don't go with the words, but you should use the words. Okay. Now, what he tries to come up and what he tries to say, every society should move in a linear fashion. And this is what development according to F.W. Riggs. Every society should move in this linear fashion from fused to prismatic and from prismatic to diffracted. This is that linear progression that every society should undergo to achieve something called development. This is what development according to F.W. Riggs. In other words, what he is trying to say, every other country should imitate the developmental activity that happened in Western countries. Fused societies should move to diffracted societies. This movement or shift of a society from fused to diffracted can happen through two forces. One is exogenic forces and other one is endogenic forces. Exogenic and endogenic. Endogenic forces means those forces which emerge from the country itself. For example, Arab Spring. Arab Spring, I think maybe some of you may know those events. Some sort of revolutionary movements happened in Arab countries. Tunisia, Libya, Egypt. If the change is because of some internal forces, that change will be more sustainable, more less formal. What is that formal? I'll try to say. If the change is because of some exogenic forces or because of some outside forces, the change will be more distorted. Today, we are witnessing some distortions in our economy just because of LPG. And the LPG is an exogenic force. It's not an endogenic force. Please understand. Because of that, today we are witnessing some structural distortions. So that is what he simply tries to say. If you want to bring a change, the change should come from within, not from the outside. If it comes from the outside, then the change will be more formal. and the change will be more heterogeneous. Heterogeneous. What is more formal? What is formalism? Formal here means, formalism means, sometimes we use, right, you are behaving too much of formal. Formal means if there is a gap between theory and reality. If there is a gap between theory and reality, means in other words, it is nothing but hypocrisy. In our constitution, we have, oh my God, great things like the state shall not discriminate. We have fundamental rights. We have preamble, values, everything. Theoretically good. Reality. The discrepancy between theory and reality, or the gap between theory and reality, is what formalism is all about. If the changes that come in India is because of heterogeneous forces, exogenic forces, there will be more formalism. And there will be more heterogeneity. More heterogeneity means there is a both traditional ways of doing things and modern ways of doing things. We have multinational companies in India. At the same time, we have MSMEs or something like cottage industries. We have this both traditional as well as modern. This is what heterogeneity. So when the change is happening because of some exogenic forces, a society will see too much of formalism, too much of heterogeneity. But if change is from within, internal, then there is less formalism and less heterogeneity. That is what the question. Again, if you just take the recorded video, you will find whatever things I just spoke, you may find it, right? That time you abused me just because sir is teaching too much of technical. What is too much of technical? There, right? Oh my God, exogenous forces. In geography, I'll read, but why in public administration? Right? This sort of assumptions you will have, but reality is different. The environmental and situational conditions under which the government operates have an important bearing on its human resources developmental practices. Though the question is from personal administration, I want to use some content that I have discussed as part of developmental dynamics. I have mentioned few things, or maybe some contents that we have mentioned, or some ideas we can use it here. There is a person called Kaushik Basu. He wrote, or he came up with a new concept called Sanskritization of corruption. Sanskritization of corruption is just a phenomenon where the lower level bureaucrats, they want to imitate the lifestyles of the higher level bureaucrats. Sanskritization of corruption means why there will be corruption? It is because of the lower level bureaucrats, they want to imitate the lifestyles of the higher level bureaucrats. But the amount of resources which they have is not on par with the higher level bureaucrats. So what is the alternative they have? They'll go for corruption. This is what Sanskritization of corruption. What I'm trying to say here is that the social aspects will have an influence on administration. And there is one more guy, Gunnar Myrdal. He writes a book called Asian Drama. He says that economy will have an impact on administration. For example, he says that if economic growth is relatively low, there will not be much money. And if there is no money, the salaries will be relatively low. And if the salaries are relatively low, the people cannot pay, the government cannot pay good amount of money to the employees. When the government cannot give good money to the employees, the talented people will not come and join in government services. If the talented people do not come and join the service, only inefficient people will come and join the service. When inefficient people come and join the service, the work which they do will be also inefficiency. When they do inefficient work, the growth also will be less. This is what we call it as mutually reinforcing vicious cycle. And now we see the other story. If there is economic growth happening, when there is more growth, you will have more revenues. When you have more revenues, you can pay high salaries. When you can pay high salaries, the job will be attractive. When the job is attractive, talented people will enter into the system. When talented people enter into the system, they will be more productive, more efficient. And they will do work with high levels of efficiency. And again, it will result in high growth. This is something he calls it as mutually reinforcing virtuous cycle. Now what I'm trying to say here is that the environment, which I mean here, the social, economic, political factors will have an influence on human development or human resources development, or in other words, on personal administration, and even the situational factors. Human resource, if you want to call a human being as a resource, he will be only a resource if you know how to deal with the situations. Today also we will find a person who, if you want to say a person, yeah, he is intelligent or he is talented, obviously we will say that when he know how to deal with certain situations. That is one ability that he should possess. We often see people who are relatively talented, but when they come up with, or when they face a new situation, they'll crumble. So we need people who can handle the situation, because organizations are dynamic, they are not static. And human resources is not again a static concept, it's a dynamic concept. And always a human being in an organization should be an asset to an organization, not a burden to the organization. And if you want to make human beings or employees always an asset, you should give them training regularly. And he should be the person who should understand the environmental and social aspects or situational aspects. However, if a country is a backward country like India or developing country like India, the amount of resources that you can spend on human resource development is very much minimal. You may not be able to spend crores of money on training purposes. So these factors you should be able to say what are those environmental and situational factors and how it will have a strong influences on human resources developmental practices. Right? So that is one thing. We can't give a sophisticated training to our human resources like in Western countries. There the training will be more professional, whether it is military or whether it is police. They'll also be trained in maybe the sophisticated or modern technology or modern warfare or modern weaponry. But Manaki, what about us? Can the training be given in the so-called modernized technologies? No, again because of the resource constraint, which is an environmental factor. Okay. So this is what 6th question is. Yeah, you can quote, but how do you substantiate? It all depends upon. It's not like you should not quote a scheme, you should not write that. It's not like that. Whatever schemes you want to write it, you can write it, but try to show how this is an outcome of the question or the theory that is being mentioned in the question. Okay, fine. You can quote, not a big deal. Because situational conditions. Lindblom. There is a guy called Charles Lindblom. He comes up with a theory called incremental theory in decision making. Again, we haven't discussed, but it's a straightforward question. Lindblom regarded rational criticism, rational decision making as an unattainable goal. Who proposed rational decision making? Herbert Simon. Now Charles Lindblom, he is criticizing the rational decision making which is proposed by Herbert Simon, because you can't achieve goals if you follow the rational decision making. You should follow the incremental approach, particularly in democratic countries like India. Not only democratic countries like India, in democratic countries. Okay. So the question is basically about asking you to write down the incremental approach and how incremental approach is relatively better than rational approach and what are the issues with rational approach. I told you how difficult rational approach is or how difficult rational decision making is all about. Because to have a rational decision making, you should know all the alternatives and you should also know the consequences of each and every alternative, and you should choose that alternative which will give you the best consequences and with less negative externalities. And because of the time constraint, because of the mind constraints, and because of the resource constraints, most of the times you can't take a rational decision, you will end up with a bounded rationality only. So instead of that, you can go for an incremental approach where you will come up with a policy. It's not just because it's logical, but it was there before. That is what incremental approach is, where you try to improve on incremental way, not something so radical. So suggest measures to avoid policy failures. When you follow an incremental approach or maybe even rational approach, you should be able to understand the realities of the policies and what type of resistance which people might offer when you come up with the new policies. Now even government believed the farm bills is something very rational policy. When you want to bring a reform of that magnitude, it is better you do it in an incremental way. Very rare you will get less resistance. Now demonetization is something so radical. Okay, 1 or 2 it will happen. But other times people will oppose, people will resist. Recently also we have discussed Telangana government wants to tag the phones of doctors. And Andhra Pradesh government also wants to, they launched an app where the teachers will be uploading a image, their photo, to give their attendance. These are something so innovative, rational, not a doubt. But if you are trying to bring a new reform, that in a democratic countries, you should follow a incremental approach rather than a rational approach. There is resistance. And this is not something which I am saying, even this is what even being told by Woodrow Wilson. When you try to bring reforms, try to take the opinion of the people or consider the opinion of the people. Right? And it should be gradual. Reform should be gradual. That reform should be gradual is what your incremental approach proposed by Charles Lindblom. This we will be discussing as part of decision making theory in chapter 3 of paper 1. Okay. 7a. Don't go with the length of the question, please. Now, sir, the question is relatively lengthy. What should I do? Lengthy question is not a criteria to define or to determine whether a question is difficult or not. Please. Of course, in optionals, you may expect, particularly in public administration, relatively lengthy questions. Question may be lengthy, that doesn't mean answer will be also lengthy. These are all assumptions which we got from our school days. Question ente undante answer enta untado. Right? The results of Washington consensus were far from optimal for transitional economies. In this background, discuss what change of directions towards post-Washington consensus. What is this Washington consensus? Washington consensus are a set of agreements that are agreed upon, particularly by the Western countries and those Western dominated institutions like your World Bank and IMF, to come up with a developmental model that suits the developing countries or the transitional countries. Even we also are victims of this Washington consensus. Where I have discussed this Washington consensus? New public management. That is the backdrop, right? So because of this Washington consensus, they try to project, which we call it as structural readjustment policies or structural adjustment policies, we call that. These are set of policies which are enforced by the developed world on the developing world, particularly in India, to get access to the financial aid when India is seriously facing the balance of payment crisis. Structural adjustment programs is an outcome of this Washington consensus. But because of this structural adjustment program, it created a lot of havoc in the transitional economies. That is what I said, exogenic forces. Exogenic forces always had a distorting effect on the economies, right? Now, what we can understand from this question is, the Washington consensus is having a Western hegemony on the third world countries or the transitional economies. Now, the post-Washington consensus should have something called maybe a global order rather than an order which is enforced by your Western countries. That time, okay, unipolar world was there. Maybe their agenda was enforced on those countries. Now, the situations are completely different. There should be proper convergence, not only within the developed world, but also developing countries and also least developed countries, right? So there should be a broad-based consensus. That is what I am trying to say. There should be a broad-based consensus. Do you think now the Western countries have hegemony that they used to have before? Do you think World Bank, IMF have that much of hegemony which they used to have before? No, surely. Now you see BRICS Bank, New Developmental Bank, which are trying to present themselves as an alternative financial institutions, right? So the post-Washington consensus should be broad-based consensus where the aspirations and expectations of the developing countries and the least developmental countries also should be given equal weightage, if not more, compared to your Western countries, right? So this is what the question. Again, you can equate this 7A is from developmental dynamics. There we have a topic from that this question was asked, right? Again, B, a sound budgeting system is one which engenders trust among citizens that the government is listening to their concerns. Elaborate this in the context of budgetary governance. Similar question was asked before. Now they have twisted the words and they framed it in a different way. So budgeting should have some principles, universal principles. Budgeting is not something that is done only in India, right? Across the world, there will be some or the other sort of budgeting. So there are some principles that you people have to follow while making of a budget. Like executive responsibility. Means executive should be responsible for drafting the budget. There should be periodicity. There should be publicity. There should be accuracy. Right? If possible, there should be participative approach also, or consultative approach, I can say. These are some principles that you should ensure while making of a budget. That's why maybe when budgeting will start in India, when budgeting starts, Nirmala Sitharaman, the finance minister, she'll be meeting different stakeholders to get the opinions. That is what I mean here by participative. And there should be periodicity. There should be periodicity means every annual, on annual basis, you should release the budget, right? So these are the things. These are the things, okay? Now, a budget is that which will bring or which will enhance the credibility of the people on the system. A budget should not be deceiving. Nowadays, we are seeing that. The extra budgetary borrowings which the governments are doing, it's not being reflected in the budget. Most of the times the numbers are so much of deceiving. And so much of complexities will be involved in the budgetary numbers. Particularly you will find this when the government is going for elections. This is what happened in 2019 when Andhra Pradesh government went for an elections. In 2019, when the TDP government presented a budget, they have showed a very bright picture of the Andhra Pradesh economy. They said, after we came to the power, మేము boom బద్దలు చేసేసినాం అని చెప్పి చూపించినారు దాంట్లో. Maybe true, I may not know. It looks a political statement, but maybe true. But when these people came to the power, they have told this existed. The previous government have manipulated every numbers. The revenue deficits is something much more than what it is being projected. So when you try to do such sort of things, obviously the credibility of the people on the budgeting system will be undermined. They lose the trust, faith. When you do not represent the so-called real picture. Even the estimate should be so realistic. Very often we find government try to say 1,50,000 will mobilize as part of disinvestments, but every year you mobilize just maybe 50% or 60% of it. Your estimates should be so accurate and it should be close to the reality. Then only people will have a trust or the credibility. In other words, budgeting is an instrument through which the trust of the people on the system can be improved. Right? So this is what actually the question is. Now you may able to mention the different types of budgeting systems which we have discussed. how these sort of budgeting systems can improve the trust and credibility which the people have on the system. Like gender budgeting. What is gender budgeting? How much of the money that we spend for women empowerment. Now social budgeting. Now we often read tribal subplan, SC subplan. What is this? This much of percentage we spent for the upliftment of particular sections. So such sort of things might improve green budgeting. Such sort of things might improve the credibility which the people have on the system. Understood? Personal administration, next question. Performance problems are rarely caused simply by lack of training, and rarely can performance be improved by training alone. Critically analyze this statement. ఏమి ఇవ్వాలో తెలియనప్పుడు ఏదో ఒకటి ఇవ్వాలి కాబట్టి, right? You understood what I mean, right? But the question is relatively easy because when you try to come up with such sort of questions, the answer will be straight, right? So we all knew performance assessment is something that Indian administration is lacking. Particularly in public organizations, we do not have a very robust system for performance assessment, and which is not the case in private organizations. In private organizations, very often you find a very sophisticated system and of course robust frameworks. But in public organizations, even if you perform, even if you do not perform, there is nothing much acknowledgement or disciplinary measures respectively, right? Now we have certain systems like performance appraisal system and annual confidential reports to really assess the performance of the bureaucrats in the government. But the question is about why a person is not performing good is not just because he is not trained properly. It's not just training is one variable, but not the complete. It's not completely dependent on training. A person is not performing good, it doesn't mean that he is not properly trained. Maybe after training he may not be motivated properly, right? Even the conditions may not be so conducive for him to work, right? Or there may be a wrong work culture. He may be trained. Yes, an IAS officer may be trained well at Lavasana, but some officers are not so maybe efficient. It's not the problem with the training alone, but it is also about other factors that might determine his performance in the organization. Right? Here you can write down the participative school ideas like supportive relationships that should be there in the organizations, right? Which we have discussed, right? So maybe the theory X sort of work cultures that should be tried to promote in organizational ecosystems, that are ideas which you can use here and there, because it's not training alone. And to improve performance also, it's not again you have to focus on the training. Again, the so-called factors that will influence individuals' performance needs to be focused upon. Right promotion channels, career advancement options, instances where his motivation and morale will be improved. Such sort of things also you have to do it. Right? So this is on personal administration, performance appraisal system. And the last question is the 8th question. Financial administration. I told you financial administration consists of resource mobilization, spending of those resources which we call expenditure, and accounting of those spendings and auditing of those accounts. These are the 4 important stages in financial administration. And now the question is on, almost 2 questions are there on budgeting, which is the first stage of financial administration. This is the question on last stage of financial administration, which is auditing. Auditing is what? Is again basically a assessment of the government spending here. The audit function has always been viewed as an integral part of government financial management. It is only through audit you can make the government accountable, or you can assess the performance of the government. You can understand the status of the government programs and schemes, how they are able to perform or not. Okay, how they are performing or not. Discuss the significance of internal audit in improving the performance of the government sector. I told you there are two important institutions with regard to auditing. One is Comptroller Auditor General of India, which will do external audit. And there is one more institution called CGA, Comptroller General of Accounts, which will do internal auditing. Internal audit is something that is happening within the organization. External audit is being done by an outside organization, right? Now CGA, in consultation with CAG, will provide a auditing framework for every organization or for every department. And every department, it is mandatory to do something sort of internal auditing. And even the Companies Act 2013 also made internal auditing mandatory, not for public organizations, but for private organizations or some companies, right? So now internal auditing is a mandatory thing, right? Now, what is the importance of internal auditing? It's very simple. The people who are working in the organization, they know better about the complexities of the organization. And if they are involved in the auditing will reflect the real picture of it. If someone is auditing some of my financial accounts, he may not really know why am I spending in a certain way. But if I do my own auditing, following a very systematic approach, I can better understand why am I spending there. It will really give the clear picture rather than some external player doing the audit, right? And when an internal player is doing an audit, the access to the accounts will be very easy. I may not give my accounts to an outside player, but if an internal person who is within the organization is doing, we openly try to share our accounts. We don't want to morph the accounts and try to give a wrong picture of it, right? The cohesion or the coordination is also will be improved when the auditing is done by internal auditor, internal auditing mechanism than an external auditor. And there are also difficulties with external audit. One external auditor cannot do auditing for all the departments. It takes years, and that is what the issue right now also. It is better that internal auditing can be done with less delays, right? So these are the issues which you people have to mention and elaborate, right? And they can also suggest improvements on the type of accountings that they have to follow, like accrual based accounting system, right? Instead of the existing accounting system where we have double entry sort of accounting system that we follow right now, which we'll be discussing later, okay? The 8B is a question from personal administration. Most civil service regimes still equate public sector ethics with anti-corruption efforts. Discuss the insufficiency of ethics code in this background. Very often we say ethics, being ethical means not doing any corrupt activity. That is not just ethical frameworks. It's not doing wrong. Ethics should also enable you to do the right thing. Doing wrong thing is a corrupt activity, but doing right thing will not be covered under corruption, no. That should be driven by an ethical framework. I may not do wrong, means I am not corrupt, but I may not also do right? So public service or public sector ethics should guide not only what should not be done, but what also should be done. A bureaucrat may not be corrupt, but he may not be efficiently working or effectively working. He may not take any bribe or he may not misuse the power, but there is no use of this guy for the public. Please understand. He may not do corrupt activity, he may not take bribe, he may not misuse the power, he may not abuse the power and authority, but he is nowhere useful for the public interest. This is not really serving the public. A person may not sign a document which is relatively controversial. If it signs, it might result in maybe some sort of corruption. But sometimes he is not also signing on the right document which is needed. Right? So public sector ethics should try to regulate the inner conscience. It's not just trying to prevent a person from not doing corrupt activities. And existing, we do have a code of conduct, but we do not have a code of ethics. So we need to come up with a proper framework so that there will be code of ethics which will be imbibed in organizational functioning. Maybe as part of that, you could have quoted second ARC recommendations which suggest for a code on ethics. And it wants to institutionalize the ethical frameworks in government functioning by creating of an authority called Public Service Authority, which I'll be discussing. Alright, so this is what the question basically. So we have to come up with maybe a new sort of framework, ethical frameworks that are sufficient in dealing with comprehensive personality of an individual rather than just preventing anti-corruption or preventing corruption. Okay. And the last question, again it is from public policy. Failure of public policies has often been attributed to problems of implementation, while implementers questions the policy design, discuss the contestation. As simple as that. If a policy gets failed, the headquarter people will criticize the field level people, that these field level people do not know anything and they are half knowledge people. They don't know how to implement the policies, illiterates. And the field level people try to say, this headquarters people will come up with a policy which is nowhere close to the reality. And they do not come out of their AC chambers and they will formulate a policy which is not even in sync with the grassroots level conditions. This is what your Karl Marx says, that fragmentation of knowledge that happens in bureaucracy because of the hierarchy, which will result in blame game. What he says, no one in the bureaucracy at a single point of time will be aware of the situation completely. The top level people will understand the situation at a macro level. The bottom level people will understand the situation at a micro level. No one in the institution will understand the situation in comprehensive level or in a comprehensive way. So this is just a lack of coordination or lack of sync between policy formulation and policy implementation or headquarters or field level agencies. So there should be a proper coordination and cooperation between policy formulation and policy implementation so that the policy formulation will try to reflect the realities and the policy implementers will understand the concerns of the policy formulators. Or in other words, if you want to really fit in some sort of theoretical concepts here, there should be something sort of a mental revolution between policy formulators and policy implementers. Each one should understand the other person's perspectives. Or you want to, if you want to add, you can add your Chris or Gris supportive relationship systems that will be there in an organization so that there will not be any sort of blame game. And sort of interaction that will try to influence in a positive way. That is what interactions influence system. If you want to really add this theoretical frameworks in this question. But here you have to write what are the problems in implementation, what are the problems in policy formulation, and because of that, why there will be a tussle between these two sort of people. Understood? This is what the question. Right? So, once again, I am really repeating the statements once again for all. The language which is being used in the question paper is relatively low. It is not the way it used to be, maybe some 6 or 7 years back. For the last 4 or 5 years, the language was really toned down. And this is just an example for it. Now, if you can know the particular concept, I think you can at least attempt the 60% of the question. And the other 40% is how do you enrich your answer? How do you express your views and how do you add value to your answer? That is the other 40% that you have to do it. But 60% means the content is almost direct. There are many straightforward questions also. అంటే మీరు బై మిస్టేక్ ఆ పేపర్ చదివిన ఆన్సర్ చేసేటట్టు ఉన్నాయి. అంటే చాప్టర్ బై మిస్టేక్ చదివినా ఆన్సర్ చేసే క్వశ్చన్స్ ఉన్నాయి పొరపాటున, రైట్? సో దిస్ ఇస్ వాట్ ది పేపర్ 1 is all about. And we'll have a discussion on paper 2, not tomorrow, maybe after Dasara. Again, I'll announce you that paper 2 is more of current affair based. It is more of current affair based. Almost good number of questions. Maybe I can say roughly 60% of the questions are directly or indirectly related to current affairs. Except Mughal administration is centralized despotism, almost other questions to some extent got related to current affairs. Understood? There, of course, I agree, 1 or 2 questions which we haven't covered in the class. Not even those areas. For example, 15th Finance Commission recommendations I gave, he asked 15th Finance Commission terms of references, which I haven't covered. I'll agree to that particular fact. I haven't discussed that, right? There is one more, about governance. What is that question? Governance is, we discussed no governance. Maybe a part of that. There are few areas, 1 or 2 areas I think, which we haven't covered because it's a dynamic topic, right? So we have to cover few current affair events, okay? So paper 1, it's again a very humble acceptance that almost we have covered good number of topics. I should not say 100% because your okay, so I should not say that 100%, but I can very confidently say good number of topics or good number of concepts are covered, right? I don't want to say all, but yes, all right, yeah. Fine, any doubts you have? Discuss the contestation. So it's better you focus on the contestations by giving a case studies or examples rather than maybe one paragraph. If you want to write it, okay, we need to have a better coordination or better synergy between these 2 stages of policy process. Just not if you don't want to end with something very pessimistic way, you can just do it. But focus on the contestations by giving some sort of examples, right? Right? So this is what the question paper is. And once again, I'll try to check, I'll try to repeat. Chapter 1, 45 marks. Chapter 2, 55 marks. And chapter 3, 50 marks. So 150 marks from the first 3 chapters. Now I think you people understood why this guy takes almost 1 month for the first 2 topics. Almost this rumor went, but this is the reality. Almost 100 marks from the first 2 topics. And this time they asked questions from chapter 3 also. Understood? Okay, fine. I'll stop here. Okay? Any doubts? Paper 2 will have a discussion, maybe post Dasara, right? Like post Washington consensus, we'll come up with post Dasara consensus. And by that time, you just try to practice answers on this question, right? Yeah, it's all about practice. Trust me, from Prithvi to this lady, 60% of the content you will have. I can, if you are consistent, I can bet 60% of the content you will have. Maybe 50 issue. The other 50% is all about how do you put down that content. There you have to work. Public administration is not like this is a 20-marker question, I'll have 20 points. Neat ga number lases rasedam anukuntunaremo. Ledu. It is all about how do you express your ideas, almost amounting to some 250 to 300 words. If it is a 20 markers, you can just reach the 250 plus or minus. 250 is fine. If you want, you can go up to 300. If you want to write 500, fine. Right? Right? But Ati should have a limitation. Right? Yeah. Chalo.